Alors, bonjour à tous et à toutes et bienvenue à cette entrevue très spéciale. Je m'appelle Audrey Perrault, stagiaire aux affaires politiques, économiques et publiques à l'Ambassade du Canada en Belgique et au Luxembourg. Et voici ma collègue Joanne Boulay, mon homologue à la mission permanente du Canada à l'Union européenne. Aujourd'hui, c'est vraiment un honneur pour nous de vous recevoir, Madame l'ambassadrice du Canada en Ukraine, Madame Larisa Galadza. C'est enchanté. Today, we would like to mark the beginning of our 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which is a really important campaign to renew our commitment to end gender-based violence against women and girls. On the occasion of this campaign, we would like to appreciate the visit of the ambassador here in Brussels to conduct a little interview and to discuss a very important issue, gender-based violence in Ukraine right now.
So as Russian war of aggression comes to its 10th month, we see more and more gender-based violence. Russian armed forces are committing acts of sexual violence that has been documented by many journalists, also human rights organizations and law enforcement agencies. Madam Ambassador, can you tell us a bit more about the current situation that we're surrounding sexual and gender-based violence in Ukraine since the war?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's really, really good. It's always good to be in Brussels, but I'm particularly pleased that you've offered me this opportunity to mark these 16 days. I'm glad that it's, for me, not getting lost in all the other craziness of the job. So thank you. It's sad that my first reaction to your question, my first instinct is to say it's the usual. It's the usual. What's happening in Ukraine with relation in respect of sex and gender-based violence in the war is the usual. It's what we've seen everywhere else in the world, where an enemy wants to terrorize, traumatize. It rapes, it tortures, it finds the most vulnerable and attacks them. So we're seeing in Ukraine what we've seen in other conflict zones and other wars all over the world. Women being raped in front of their children, their husbands, men being tortured with rape, children as well. So it's not flippant. I don't mean to be flippant or dismissive in saying it's the usual, but it's what happens everywhere else, and it's horrific, and it should always be horrific to us.
Thank you very much. So right now we would like to know currently what are the efforts that are being undertaken by the Ukrainian government, civil society, humanitarian actors in terms of gender-based violence against women and girls?
So there's so much being done, and it's building on the base of work and progress that was there before the invasion on the 24th. I would also note sort of one of the things that we know happens in war zones and in areas of conflict, and even adjacent to conflict, is that domestic violence increases. So that's happening as well. And so what was Ukraine doing before? Ukraine was destigmatizing domestic violence. Ukraine, with the leadership of the First Lady, was making great efforts to ensure Ukrainians understood that domestic violence is not a private matter. And one of the most powerful exhibits I've ever seen on SGBV was my first year in Kyiv, where they made a display of regular household items. And they told the stories of how these household items were objects of domestic violence and abuse. And there were huge campaigns in Ukrainian society to ensure that no one turned a blind eye to this, and that victims knew that there were places where they could go for support. So that's one important thing that Ukraine was doing before the invasion, with the help of countries like Canada, and since the invasion, they have done even more to destigmatize all of the evils that come with war, and how those can enter even the home. So and lots of talk about mental health. That's the first thing. The second thing is before the invasion, we were doing a lot on, and Ukraine was doing a lot to open more shelters for women and children, and now they are opening even more shelters for victims of SGBV and violence as a result of the war. Safe places where women can come. They're also doing more to go to where the services are needed, especially health services and psychosocial supports, and those are things like mobile units, going to the people. The people are displaced; they are in unfamiliar surroundings, or they are still maybe in their homes or in their communities, but no longer have the connectivity out or the supports that will take them to where there's help. So this idea of going to where the services are needed, providing those services in a mobile way, is really important. Ukrainians are also really focused on accountability and making sure that every crime is, every instance of SGBV is investigated and ultimately punished, and that Russians are held to account for what they've done. So I guess those are sort of three big areas that are really, really important to Ukrainian society, to Ukrainian government, and I think to victims, as we know, from all over the world. In July, Ukrainian Parliament ratified the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe related to eliminating all forms of discrimination against and gender-based violence. That is really, really important. Why? Because there's a lot of resistance to that. There was a lot of resistance from some vocal elements of society before the invasion, and women's organizations in Ukraine and had lobbied hard to ratify that convention. And it's a convention that puts an international frame around everything that Ukraine was already doing, and it connected them to the global efforts to end domestic violence and to address its scourges. But they could never get it through. And in the context of the war, in the context of Ukraine's desire to become a member of the European Union, a lot of the barriers went away. And so Ukraine was able to to ratify this convention. It is now part of the community that says this is the framework that we're going to adhere to, and it provides a measure, a backstop, a more firm basis for the work of all of the women's organizations in Ukraine and everyone who is advocating to end violence against women. So that was a huge moment, and I hope that sometime soon or very soon after the war ends, we're able to recognize the efforts of all the women in Ukraine who worked for years to ratify this convention, who deserve to take a moment out and really celebrate that achievement.
Thank you for your answer. I think it's really important to see that Ukraine is doing things. They're active. They started way before the war. Russian war of aggression just highlighted what was going on, but it's great to see that the organizations are doing well. It's also, we're curious to know what is Canada doing to help also the Ukrainian civilians, mostly on sexual and gender-based violence.
Just as Ukraine was working before the invasion to address these issues, Canada was too. And I think the fact that we paid attention to issues of domestic violence, of gender analysis, SGBV, we were paying attention to it and programming in relation to it before the war. It created a really important foundation after the invasion for us to be able to scale up. So, a few things. we have been supporting UNFPA, and we doubled our contribution to $14 million when the war started, to provide some of those mobile services that I talked about earlier, to make sure that they could quickly get to where the needs were. And it's really important that the UN be there providing these services, because, as I understand it, Ukrainian women still do feel the stigma of sexual and gender-based violence, and I think they trust the UN agencies with their care. So those mobile units are really important. We're also supporting the investigations into the war crimes and other alleged crimes against humanity, to make sure that the accountability is there. We owe that not just to the Ukrainians, but to the rules-based international order, to the global community, to make sure that where those atrocities are taking place, there are also investigations. A third thing that we're doing in all of the, before the invasion, we were working closely with women's organizations all over Ukraine and promulgating this localization agenda, take the women, peace and security agenda down to the most local level. And that, again, really important foundation for what then we were able to do after the invasion, which was say to our partners, do what you need to do with our funding. And they were able to quickly reallocate their project funds to whatever was necessary in those early days of the war. But of course, because of the kinds of organizations that they were, because they had this built-in, or have this built-in approach, which is to think about the marginalized, to think about the gendered impacts, or the gender effects of the war, they were able to respond quickly with those principles, and address the needs of the local community, and they were already there. So I'm really proud of everything the department did to make sure that we could allow them to quickly use their funding however they needed to.
We have one last question for you, Madam Ambassador. We would like to know, it's more a global question. What is Canada currently doing? What are their priorities in Ukraine at this very moment?
I think I'd break the priorities we have into three. Canada's doing so much to address, all the different fronts on which this war is being fought, and so I think sort of three categories. First, we're doing everything that we can to make sure that Ukraine wins this war, and that means weapons. The first tranche, weapons, macro-financial stability, money they need to just keep going, and people, the humanitarian assistance needed to keep people alive, to keep the people in the country who are in the country, so that Ukraine is there when this war ends, so that there is something to rebuild. Secondly, Canada has made it a priority to make sure that the free and democratic world stands with Ukraine. Not because Ukraine is somehow unique or special, but because Ukrainians are dying for freedom and democracy. So if you call yourself a democratic country that respects the rules-based international order, you need to stand with Ukraine. You need to stand on the right side of history. And that's not a foregone conclusion internationally. And so our colleagues all over the world, but especially in multilateral missions, are working really, really hard to make sure that Ukraine in the world has as much support as it can have. And whether it's the UN, at the G7 table, at NATO, here even at the EU, Canada is advocating on behalf of Ukraine, on behalf of the principles that Ukrainians are dying for, which are our principles and our values. So that's the second priority I think that we've had. And I think that the third priority is just to make sure that Ukrainians know that we're with them. And here, the fact of our embassy being open in Kyiv is really, really important. I'm not saying that because I think it's important. I'm saying it because Ukrainians have told us it's important. The person on the street, right up to the prime minister and people in the president's office, say thank you for being here. It is so important in this fight for their life, fight for their very right to exist, that Ukrainians know they are supported, the Ukrainians know that the world stands with them. And so being there, inviting them to Canada for conferences, like the Halifax International Security Forum that I was just at, or this Rebuild Ukraine conference that happened down on Bay Street in Toronto just the other day. Little notes of support. Small care packages, text messages that say I'm thinking about you, from that right up to millions of dollars in macro financial assistance or support for winterization projects. All of that says to Ukrainians, we are with you, and that is in small part, I hope, a reason that they can continue to fight. Here in the 10th month of the war now.
Madame l'ambassadrice, merci beaucoup d'avoir échangé avec nous sur ce sujet aujourd'hui. Ça fait un honneur de vous avoir. It's such a sensitive issue, but we think it's so important to have this discussion and also, like you mentioned earlier, to have a Canadian presence on the ground that can see what's actually going on and offer a more adequate and specific help to Ukrainian victims. Alors, pour la fin de votre mandat, je vous souhaite le meilleur.
And for everyone watching online, thank you. We hope this interview gave you more of a bit detailed information, but also perspective about gender-based violence. Continue to share the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.